Well, I guess I can at least start the intro. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us for tonight's Science Cafe with Jagesh Shah and Dr. Anu Puri. My name is Matt Schuman. I am a programming librarian here at Cary Library. Please let me know if there are any technical issues that I can try to resolve, and you can send those via the chat. Before we begin, I just want to take a moment to thank the Cary Library Foundation, whose mission it is to raise private funds for the library. Their support enables us to bring programs like tonight's event to you. Foundation plays a unique role with the Science Cafe series and also produces the content for these programs. If you have any questions, please submit them via the Q&A button. Jagesh Shah will be your host for this evening. Jagesh is a distinguished scientist with a background in biology, computation, and engineering, who is also a Lexington resident, former Cary Library Foundation board member, and the creator of the Science Cafe series. Jagesh, welcome. I'm now going to hand the evening off to you to host and introduce our special guest for the evening.
Thank you very much, Matt. And yeah, welcome everyone to the Cary Library Science Cafe. I'm Jagesh Shah. I'm a local Lexingtonian scientist and your host for this evening. So for those of you new to the Science Cafe, we gather, every month or so to meet scientists in our neighborhood. And for those of you that have lived here long enough, you know that it's not difficult to find them. They're in every nook and cranny. They're at our coffee shops, on our soccer fields, in our hockey rinks. So together we have a conversation with them to try to figure out, really get an idea of how they got to where they are, what they're doing now, and how they do it. And it's been my privilege to interview a number of people who really have distinguished themselves, and tonight is no exception. I did want to give a brief view on the COVID conversations that we've had before I introduce our speaker. So last year we actually started our COVID conversations with Mike Keneally, who again a Lexington resident and the Mass Secretary of Housing and Economic Development, and he was also part of the Reopening Advisory Board. He provided a great perspective on how the state government had been, critical in, weathering the pandemic. In particular, he pointed out and highlighted a lot of the collaborations between our healthcare sector as well as the thriving biotech community. And I think, we were lucky enough then to kind of transition to the biotech community at our last Science Cafe with Melanie Iverson, who's the Chief Development Officer at Moderna. And she gave us a really, a key understanding of both the medicine that they and a number of others have developed, as well as the clinical trials that went into, really ensuring that these were safe and some of the amazing logistics required to be able to pull off a clinical trial during a pandemic. Tonight, we're having the opportunity to really get into the logistics of, of the healthcare activities that went on in Massachusetts. And Anu Puri is the Chief Data Officer at the Massachusetts Hospital and Healthcare Association. And she'll describe, what that means, Chief Data Officer. But, essentially her team plays a critical role in taking the data out of our healthcare system and understanding, providing analysis and predictions of our readiness. And so you can imagine that COVID-19 pandemic was an unprecedented test of that, of that role, and bringing together how we, the data and what data we really needed, the predictions and the performance of our healthcare system, and being able to essentially, work with a variety of other stakeholders to craft in real time how to really make sure that we could weather this pandemic. So thanks for being here, Anu. And I always like to start at the beginning, and the beginning is your beginnings. So, where did you grow up? What were your early influences in bringing you to science?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me here today. I am honored to be in such a distinguished company of previous speakers. And I look forward to our conversation. I hope I can shed some light on what was happening inside hospital walls during the past 2 years. As far as where I grew up and my early influences, I guess this was a little bit unusual. I grew up partly in Africa and partly in India. So my childhood was in Africa and West Africa, specifically in a town in southeastern Nigeria, an idyllic little university town where my father was a mathematics professor. And then the latter half of my teenage years and early adulthood was in India, specifically in Lucknow, which is a town in the northern part of the country.
Yeah, so as this being the Science Cafe, where where did that intersection with science start for you?
It's kind of strange to be asked that question because I don't remember a time when it wasn't a given that we would pursue science, myself and my sister. My father being in the field that he was, my mother was a chemistry teacher, so it was kind of in our DNA. I would think that the two things that contributed to that were our home was one where curiosity and discussion and debate was always encouraged. So we always had, it was filled with books, it was filled with journals, newspapers, news magazines, some of which were actually mailed to us as far away as India and the United States and growing up. And we're encouraged to read them from cover to cover, whether we understood them or not, and then have robust debates with my father about them. So that I'm sure contributed in some way to our curiosity. And the other story is actually a little bit funny. Our family and our house was the unofficial repair shop for the Indian community. There was quite a big Indian community in that university town, as you can imagine. And they would buy all kinds of electronics and mechanical equipment, clocks and things like that. And my father loved to repair things. And we were his assistants. So our house was always full with things in different stages of disrepair. And I remember particularly one summer where everyone seemed to have bought a Swiss cuckoo clock at the same time. And they all seemed to, fall apart at the same time. And we had about between, I think, 15 and 20 cuckoo clocks on our living room wall. And they would all come out in midday and midnight and cuckoo at the same time. So obviously my mother wasn't too happy about that. But I think between tinkering around and being curious, subliminally contributed to our interest in science, both myself and my sister, who's an engineer.
Wow. And so, and you chose a slightly different path in engineering. And where did, what was your interest that spurred you into medicine early?
Yeah, I wish I could tell you a more glamorous story, but the truth of it is that, like any good Indian girl of that generation studying science, you had to choose a path, engineering and or medicine. And I had a lifelong fear of numbers, which is ironic considering what I do now. So I just went into that path. But I do remember distinctly the moment when I made that decision. And I remember it because it came in an unusual fashion. There's this great book. It's actually still in print, called Emma and I. And it's about a blind woman and her dog, Emma. And it's about the relationship between a blind person and their guide dog. It's a very, very interesting book. But about 3/4 of the way through the story, she meets an eye surgeon who's able to restore her sight. And that changes her relationship with her dog. And the story is beautiful. I still remember aspects of it. But the part that stuck with me, the 12-year-old me, was the eye surgeon and what he was able to do. And I remember getting up, putting the book down, going downstairs and declaring to my parents, I've made my decision. I'm going into medicine. So that is clear in my mind about how that happened.
Wow, a whole bunch of Lexington parents are asking their 12-year-olds right now what they want to be. But yeah, so that training is a grueling one. It's not just undergraduate training. There's a lot of what we would call practice through internship and residency. And so what specific area did you choose? And then I think that there's a coda to that for you in terms of then maybe thinking that you moved, and then maybe you can tell us a little bit about kind of that transition from medicine to what you do now.
Sure. Yes. So I moved to the US just over 20 years ago. And I had just finished, as you said, a grueling residency of 3 years in OBGYN. And that, knowing India's birth rate, you can imagine how grueling that residency is, typically one of the most grueling in India. And I was facing the prospect of another 3-year residency, maybe longer in the US before I could practice. And I just didn't want to jump into that directly. So I thought it would be a good idea to learn how the US healthcare system works. I thought an MPH was a good idea, a way to learn that. And I thought I would complete that and then go back into practice. As it happened, I met 2 transformational professors. Here's where your life's trajectory changes when you least expect it. One of them, who is a well-known figure in health policy across the country, Nancy Turnbull, introduced me to healthcare policy and all the systems that we have currently in the US and all the work that still needs to be done to improve those systems, which was fascinating to me. And the other professor was Dorothy Puri, who at the time was the chief financial officer at Dana-Farber. And she was my healthcare finance professor. And she managed to do the impossible, which is get rid of my lifelong fear of numbers. And she showed me what stories numbers can tell. And I don't even think that she knows this, but she essentially led me to where I am, which is MHA. I started at MHA many, many years ago. And my initial responsibilities were just to track financial performance of hospitals and utilization trends and things like that. But as you probably realize, most people, I think, who are listening, Massachusetts tends to be at the forefront of healthcare change, even though that change happens at a glacial pace. We were ahead of the game in coverage expansion. We were ahead of the game in payment reform. We're always trying to do delivery system reform. And now we're trying to try cost containment. So things are always evolving. Our legislature is always proposing new bills. Our governor is always proposing new ways to improve the healthcare system. So you have to keep up with that. And so over the years, my job and my team's job has evolved to really understanding both federal and both public proposals as well as from the private sector, but primarily state and federal proposals to reform the healthcare system and their impact on hospitals and the healthcare system. So that's just about everything. And the past 2 years have been all COVID all the time. So very different from where I started.
Yeah, it is. And, I loved how you prefaced this. So I'm going to go learn about the American healthcare system and go get an MPH. So I'm putting you down as for another program where you're going to explain the American healthcare system to all of us, because apparently
it's going to have to be a long program.
Yeah, but as you say, a changing environment, and you and your team responsible for that. But maybe we've just take a one step back. What does the MHA do? This might be a new organization that other people may be unfamiliar with. So and what's your role within that?
So MHA represents the vast majority of hospitals across the state. And we also have non-hospital members. Most of the hospitals, acute care hospitals in the state are our members, and many of the post-acute hospitals are our members. But we also have non-hospital membership. And our 3 primary roles are education, information, and advocacy. And for me specifically, the information and education piece is key. I do take part in the advocacy part, but we have another group that is really, has that government relations role. But my role is really to understand, my team's role and my role is to understand what is changing in the healthcare system and understand it on a data-driven basis, and try to explain, so educate our members about what is happening, how it will impact them, inform them of what the other options might be, and then work with our advocacy team to make sure that we effectively advocate on behalf of our members to make sure that whatever changes are happening are either beneficial or at least not harmful to them. So that's really my role. And one other thing I wanted to mention is that it's a vantage point that is different perhaps than being working at a hospital. So what I always ask myself is what's unique about working at MHA and when I hire new people on my team. And I think what it does is you don't have to grapple with the day-to-day operations of an individual entity, but by nature of our role, we get a broader view of the entire industry, the hospital industry, but also beyond the hospital industry into other sectors of the healthcare system, and then beyond that into the social service sector, which intersects with healthcare, as we all know. And then the advocacy piece of it puts us in into contact with state government, state administration, and the federal delegation. So it's a vantage point that is at equal parts exciting and interesting, but sometimes also very frustrating, because change in healthcare happens very, very slowly. That Titanic doesn't turn easily. But I have been privileged over the past 2 decades that I've been at MHA to not only work with all these stakeholders that I just mentioned, but also people across hospitals, from those working on the front lines, the chief nursing officers, the nursing directors, to those working in quality improvement, those working in finance, the government relations people, and then of course the C-suite. So I consider myself very privileged to have the opportunity to work with such motivated, positive, passionate people. I'm impressed every day by the people that I work with.
Wow, that speaks to a healthcare system that really is, even at steady state and non-pandemic times, working towards a dedicated group working towards providing that for our population. But I thought one of the things he said was very interesting, the glacial pace. And so there is that glacial pace of healthcare change, and now upon us suddenly comes COVID. And your team is almost, kind of the center of this system, right? Taking all the data, providing information, advocating particular positions so that, people can be responsive. But again, in the context of slow turnover, now, what were some of those first signs, and what was it like to be on the front line when COVID-19 appeared on our shores?
Yes. So let me take you back to late January, early February of 2020. Around that time is when we stopped making fun of those colleagues of ours that were stockpiling pasta and tuna fish and started taking this seriously. Because until then it was like, are you kidding me? You're storing rice and pasta under your bed. What's wrong with you? And we realized, oh my goodness, this is real. It's coming. So all those rumblings and mumblings from China became real for us. And my team at that time was essentially asked to, do some modeling and figure out, well, what kind of resource needs would we have? And what kind of resource crunch might we face as a state? And essentially at that time, the key resources were ICU beds, ventilators, PPE, and medical surgical beds. Those were the critical resources that we knew that we would need. PPE is a little bit harder to model because we don't have a lot of data on that. But I do want to provide your audience with some context as to where we are as a state when it comes to data. We are one of the most data-rich states in the entire country. There's an enormous amount of data collected about hospitals and from hospitals and reported publicly and transparently. And the hospital specific, it's not aggregated, it's hospital specific information. It's out there for the taking. So, an enormous amount of data is collected by an agency called the Centers for Healthcare Information and Analysis. They have all kinds of reports they produce on, you name it, hospital payments, hospital utilization, paramix, payment variation between hospitals, any topic that you can think of, there's data out there and it's available. And in fact, they also collect, it's hard to believe this, some of our other states, when they listen to us, they're like, what is wrong with you guys? We our hospitals submit on an annual basis a detailed cost report, which is schedule upon schedule of the cost structure of the hospital, exactly what goes into producing a unit of care. And what is really pertinent to this conversation is that cost report also includes information on occupancy and beds. So when my team was asked to do this analysis, we thought, oh, we're a data-rich state, we can do this. And we took the data that was coming in from China and Italy at the time about, positivity rates and about hospital utilization for COVID patients and how many of them ended up in the ICU and on vents. And then we coupled it with census data and then this data that we had on beds and occupancy. And we wanted to make some initial projections. And I will never forget that day as long as I live, when we put in the last number into that spreadsheet and we hit enter and it spat out some numbers at us. as to how many beds we would need as a state, medical surgical beds, ICU beds, and ventilators, because the numbers were orders of magnitude what we actually had available. And I distinctly remember printing out that spreadsheet and going downstairs to my CEO's office, and my hands were shaking a little bit. And I said to him, Steve, if this is real, we are in serious trouble. We're going to have patients in corridors. We're going to have patients in ambulance bays. We might even have patients in the street. There is no way we can create this many beds in such a short amount of time. This tsunami is coming at us, and we don't have enough resources. And he just asked me, and he's famously calm. He's always calm. And he said to me, how sure are you? And that made me think for a second. And I said, well, I'm only as sure as the data is good. And he said, okay. And he did what he does, which is he took what we had calculated, and he talked to the people, the powers that be in the state government, and started getting that mobilized. And he asked me to go back and try to make sure that we had better data. And I think about this as the first stage of the pandemic, when we realized that even in such a data-rich state, we could not be sure of the accuracy of the information we were using to make these predictions, which had huge implications for the state. And the reason we couldn't be sure is it was 2 years old, it was incomplete, it was inconsistent, and we couldn't be sure that people were putting things in the right buckets. So we needed, at that time, it became very clear, and we're talking about like mid to late February of 2020, it became clear we needed to have a different system to collect more current data on a more regular basis that was important for the pandemic. And you may very well ask, why don't we have such a system? Why isn't the state prepared to collect more current data? And we actually do have such a system. We have a system called the Web EOC, which means Web Emergency Operations Center. It's a FEMA setup. It's an online tool, and it's meant to quickly get information on resource availability in a crisis. But it wasn't designed for the amount of information we needed to manage a pandemic, the granularity of it, the level of detail that we needed to know. I mean, a bed is not a bed, is not a bed. A patient is not a patient, is not a patient. So we thought initially that we would just create a survey monkey. I mean, it's funny to even think about this, but we at one point, my manager and I were thinking, you know what, the state doesn't have any tools, the feds are asleep. Let's create a survey monkey and shoot it out every evening, have people report to us. We will crunch it in the night. We'll send it back out in the morning to those that need to know. And that way we can manage resources. And we were just starting to figure out how to do this in a proper way when the state government, stepped in and, they said they wanted to partner with us, and they decided that they would work collaboratively with MHA to retool the Web EOC system to make it more appropriate for, collecting more regular data that would be relevant to the pandemic. And so we worked with them intensely over the next few weeks to get the definitions nailed down, because anyone who works with data knows definitions are key. Everybody's got to be playing, by the same playbook, otherwise data is meaningless. So by mid-April or so, we had a good set of data metrics that everybody agreed were critical to have, and we had 100% participation among all hospitals in the state. We thought we were good to go, and then the federal government stepped in. They finally woke up from their slumber early. I mean, everyone remembers early on their whole ham-handedness of their approach was astonishing, but they stepped in and they said, no, you have to report it our way. Everybody across the country has to report our set of metrics that we will define and we will determine, and we will change as we see fit. And they tied that reporting to the availability of remdesivir. If you didn't report, you didn't get remdesivir, and you also didn't get federal dollars. So everybody then had to switch over from whatever we'd done as a state and start reporting the federal government data set, which is fine. In retrospect, I think it is important for the entire country to be reporting the same set of metrics, but you would think they would have gotten involved right from the beginning. I mean, there was a day in mid-July of 2020 when they suddenly overnight added 60 new metrics to the data set, and people woke up the next morning and they're, what do these mean? How do you define them? It was complete chaos. So those are some of the early stories. Yes.
Right. Yeah. So but in that early kind of, so first of all, you had to shift to a rapid data model, right? One in which, you had to have models that were changing in real time. And, so it is interesting to think about what a survey monkey would do. I mean, I think of it as, it's the way that I ask my team, what do they want for lunch? So, it's like remarkably deep way to use it. But ultimately, what did you kind of converge on? Before the federal government stepped in, you guys had a system, right? And that seemed to be working. And what was that like?
That was essentially a retooled web EOC system.
Okay.
So FEMA has a system in place that collects 2 or 3 data elements. We modified, or they modified it with our help, to collect about, I think at that point, 30 or 40 key metrics that we needed. Primarily, we were focused on ICU bed availability and occupancy and med-surg bed availability and occupancy. And we were just starting to make inroads into what exactly to collect about PPE. Because some of the pushback we got on PPE data collection was, what is the point of reporting this to you? It's not like you will take this information and get PPE. So there was this pushback, understandably. These are overstretched hospitals, and they didn't want to report anything beyond what was absolutely necessary. So we tried to focus only on the things we absolutely had to have. The level of COVID occupancy at hospitals and the bed availability of critical, and then of course, ventilators.
Right. And
But
so
then the Fed stepped in and they just blew the whole thing up.
yeah, but these hospitals then would report into you, and then you guys would provide kind of these projections as to what would be required.
Yes. So we would take the data, we would run some analytics on it, we would ship it back out to hundreds of people across the state, and they were all using it in their own different ways. Some people were doing regional modeling. Some people were just tracking this for understanding what was happening within their healthcare system, their own, hospital system and things like that. So we would ship out both our projections as well as the raw data for people to do with it whatever they felt they needed to do. And then the state was using the exact same data to do its own projection. So it was a very useful data set.
Wow.
Up to a point, which we'll talk about later.
Yeah, no, so that, I mean, so I already you get the sense, I get the sense that, you're used to this very slow turnover of data, having a lot of time to work on models, and now you have to reinvent your entire data model essentially in real time, and you have to be able to provide projections to people about, what might be going on. So, so how do things evolve now from that point? So now we're at the state where the feds are coming in, right? And the feds have now laid out all of this stuff, and admittedly, they do have big pockets, so they can create a lot of incentives, and if used correctly, this can be a powerful tool. And but things, we've seen the many waves, we've seen the many variants. How did you guys respond to that, and how did the system evolve, both from the perspective of the feds kind of coming in, as well as these new projections of what the virus was going to do?
So maybe I'll answer your question in a slightly different way.
Sure.
There was evolution in how we obtained data and what we did with it and where we're going with that. But before I do that, I just want to step back and talk about some of the things that happened as a result of the data, as a result of this crisis we found ourselves in. And some of these stories are untold stories, which I'd like to share today, because I think of this as an opportunity to share with folks who might not be as aware of what was happening behind the scenes, so to speak. So to me, from my perspective, there are hundreds of untold stories, some of them sad and some of them, great stories of courage. But from my perspective, there are 4 untold stories of the pandemic. One is to what extent competitive concerns were put aside to collaborate. And this is it's such a great story. It's such an uplifting story, because our hospitals ultimately are competitors. They've been competitors before I was born. And yet they put all that aside to collaborate and you just put compassion and collaboration above everything else. And early on, it became clear. And one of the greatest stories that came out of the pandemic came from Boston. So in Boston, we have these world-class hospitals that are competitors. And in those early fuzzy days of the pandemic, when nobody really knew what was the best treatment protocol and what was going on, there was really no real-time data or anything of that sort. The critical care, the heads of critical care departments and emergency departments in the Boston AMCs, academic medical centers, just kind of organically came together and set up this ad hoc system for communicating with each other. They would meet for 15 minutes twice a day, and they would exchange information on, who needed transfers, who could accept a transfer, what were the patients that absolutely needed to be transferred and for what capability. And in addition to that, they would share information with each other about what they were learning about how to treat COVID, which to me is an amazing story. Because at the time, as you remember, nobody really knew what was the best path. It was all ventilators and ventilators for a long time, and then it was proning, and then the people were finding out different things about remdesivir and so on and so forth. Those conversations were so helpful that eventually we actually copied that model across the state of having, clinical leadership talk to each other. So that's a great untold story. Another one I think that gets lost, because we do have a tendency to think of the government as a slow-moving, inefficient beast. I don't agree with that. And this particular experience has been very, very illuminating as to what a good partnership with the state can do. The state set up this COVID command center, and they brought in people from all their agencies, the best and the brightest. And they used that COVID command center as a single point of contact. So whether you had questions about changing regulations, and we know regulations were changing every single day to accommodate this emergency, changing reporting requirements, resource needs. So we had multiple forums where we used to interact with the COVID command center, but I personally had a meeting where a 1-hour meeting every single day where hospitals would dial in and the COVID command center would dial in, and they would provide, as current information as they had about what they were projecting and what they were thinking, and when the remdesivir was coming in and how it would be distributed and what regulation was going to be relaxed and what was not going to be relaxed. And then if we had any questions for the feds, they would channel it through the state instead of every hospital trying to reach out. So it was such a critical part of the response. And I feel as if that's completely lost in the conversation. So that's my second untold story. And you have to bear with me, I have 2 more. Another aspect of this, which is very dear to my heart, is the heroic efforts that took place within hospital walls. So I think the public is largely unaware of this, but when we realized the resource needs that we had in terms of ICU beds and medical surgical beds, there was a grand mobilization that took place within our hospitals at huge financial cost to create those beds. So by way of context, nationally, we have about 2.4 beds per 1,000 population. In Massachusetts, it's about 2.3. So that works out to be about 15,500 beds, depending on how you define beds in hospitals. And nationally, it's about just under 800,000. When at the height of the pandemic, around April 2020, hospitals in Massachusetts had increased their ICU bed by 88%. That's almost a doubling of ICU beds. And ICU beds are not easy to create. These are, technology intensive beds. And the only reason it happened was because they used non-traditional spaces. They surged into, created these surge staffed ICU beds. They redeployed staff. They used technology in the most innovative way. And they just put financial concerns aside to create this capacity. And I would say that is the primary reason why we didn't have patients in ambulance bays, and we didn't have patients in corridors, and we didn't end up having those kinds of scenes play out in the streets of Boston. And no one has told this story. In fact, the reporting on this was so bad that I remember one night in summer of 2020, there was actually a story on one of the news channels that only 2% of ICU beds in Massachusetts are occupied. And I almost fell off my chair. Like 2% of beds are occupied. We're running at like 98% capacity or 98% occupancy. And it turned out that this was a metric that somebody had put out from the state for no rhyme or reason, where they put the denominator was every kind of bed in the state: field hospital bed, rehab bed, long-term care bed, psych bed, acute care bed, ICU bed, occupied, unoccupied, staffed, unstaffed, every single kind of bed that you could define as a bed. If it had 4 legs, it went into the denominator. And then the numerator was how many people are in the ICUs. So obviously it ended up at 2%. But it was reported as if 2% of ICU beds were occupied. What it actually represented was that of all the beds in the universe of beds, 2% are ICU occupied beds. but that's how it was reported.
Hmm.
And it felt like a blow that, you know, the implication was, what's all the fuss about? 2% of ICU beds are occupied. So I feel like somebody needs to tell this story about the efforts that were made by hospitals and at what cost. And that brings me to the last untold story. Is when we created these beds, one of the ways we did them was to shut down electives. All elective surgeries were shut down. Now, it is what it is. This is the way that hospitals run. Their margins and the revenue they generate is higher on the surgical side than on the medical side. So while people might have this impression that all the industries in the economy, the one that has no cause to complain is the hospital industry, because those guys were bursting at the seams. And so they must have made out like bandits. It's actually the opposite. If we hadn't received the federal relief and the state relief that we received, almost 90% of our hospitals would have been in the red in 2020. And even with the relief, we had 40% of our hospitals in the red. So the immediate financial impact of the pandemic was huge, and it's still playing out. We don't really know where it's going to end because we all know the pandemic isn't over. So I don't even remember what your question was, Jack, but I wanted to talk about these stories because I'm taking the opportunity.
I'm glad that you did. I think it really did underscore. So the question was really one around, you know, how did you evolve this system, right, to be able to get to all these pieces? And I think you hit one critical high note for me, which is, you know, how, you know, we couldn't have possibly done this, you know, through a centralized system. Each person had to realize what did they need to do, and they had to come together. And the idea that, you know, there are all these phone calls taking place, like literally phone calls where people are talking about, you know, these are the kinds of patients we need. This is, you know, who has access to these kinds of resources while we'd like to transfer. And under that, which is, I think, you know, I was luckily, you know, I have a number of friends that are physicians. And so I can speak to, just as you said, which was literally trying out what they could in real time and reporting it out, saying, you know, in real time, this is what we're trying. It seems to work. These are the observations we're making. We're getting a lot of patients that have, you know, clotting. Has anybody else seen that? So this, you know, it was almost an opportunity to bring everybody together. So again, you know, and these are places that are constantly trying to, you know, make sure that they can divert the patient stream towards them. That's kind of a steady state activity. But in the pandemic, these cooler heads prevailed in terms of how to be able to bring what they needed to do to themselves. And it's always the case that, you know, we can always look at the financial aspects of any system and try to understand how people are trying to make money out of it. But the idea that we're going to take all these spaces and turn them into ICU spaces. And for those of you, you know, I hope, you know, it's not the kind of thing I hope people have seen before, but it is remarkable. An ICU is a patient surrounded by just basically a large number of instruments, right? Monitoring every single physiologic function that's going on to be able to make sure that we can monitor them. So the idea that you're going to replicate this in various parts of the hospital, yeah, it's astounding. So I can't, you know, what the story you told is one, as you say, one that we haven't heard before. And it really comes from, you know, understanding what drove the data towards, you know, making sure that people made these kinds of decisions. So yeah, I'm glad that you covered that. I'm glad that, you know, we brought out, you know, what data can really do when there are people who are listening and understand their mission and understand, and your predictions are the ones that are getting people activated, right? To be able to tell them, you know, what's actually coming. So I guess now that's on the front end. That was the kind of the evolution. And as you say, it's not over yet, but there are clearly some learnings that we should be taking away. And, you know, some of these things are things that I think you will probably try to make sure stay in place and maybe easier than others. But, you know, what's your thinking around that in terms of, the learnings that came to the fore and that have really stuck with you and that you hope will persist?
So from a data perspective, I think two of them really stick out. One is that even with the daily data collection that we were doing after all the scrambling around in 2020, there are things that change more rapidly than you can collect data. And what started to happen in the second year of the pandemic, as we entered the second surge in winter of 2020 into 2021, was it was no longer ventilators and ICUs. So it wasn't something we could track easily. It was actually staffing, and it was changing by the shift. So the denominator itself was changing. So collecting occupancy doesn't have much meaning if your denominator is changing constantly from shift to shift. So one of the things that we put in place is we followed the model of Boston, and we created a similar model across the state in 5 regions of the state, where clinical leadership would meet for 15 minutes, 20 minutes every single day. And they would talk about real-time data with each other and what resource crunches they were facing, who needed to transfer patients, who could accept them, what sort of pressure their ED was facing, because our EDs were bursting at the seams. And then that information collected from each region would then be disseminated across the whole state. So this model has actually worked really well, and I hope that we can keep it going because it can be used for other purposes as well. These are people who, honestly, I was shocked. I was shocked to hear that some of them didn't know who was the person to call at the hospital next door. The critical care doc of hospital A did not necessarily have the contact information of hospital B. They were maybe 2 blocks away from each other. So making those connections was one of the key learnings from this. And the second piece of it, which I really think is the key takeaway that we're working on right now, and I hope we succeed, is that we cannot rely on a system that requires ad hoc meetings and text messaging to figure out where we are as a state in a crisis situation. We need real-time data. We need visibility. We need situational awareness. Certainly we need it statewide, but ideally we need it within the region and nationally. There were patients being, we were getting calls from Tennessee to transfer patients to Massachusetts.
Wow.
It was, and then we have stories about ED docs having to make 47 calls to transfer 1 patient. In today's day and age, we shouldn't have to depend on technologies of the 18th century to be able to transfer patients, to understand where the resource crunches are. So what we hear again and again from clinical leaders as the first and most important data lesson from this pandemic, and I'm sure there are lessons of all kinds, but the data lesson is real-time situational awareness is key. Whether it is a no-notice event like mass casualty, or God forbid, a hospital flooding and you need to evacuate, you need to know where the beds are. Or something slow moving like a pandemic. We cannot do this again. We cannot let this crisis go to waste. So right now, my team and I, we are working with a group of clinical leaders to try to identify not just the technology that will enable us to do this, but even more important, the processes and the protocols that we will put in place. Because again, as I said, these are competitors, right? There's always that competitive concern about how much about yourself do you want to reveal to the whole world, which is completely understandable. But I think a crisis, overcomes that. And there's recognition that there's a certain amount of information that does have to be shared openly and transparently if we are to make efficient decisions in the future. So I'm really excited. It's the technology itself seems to be pretty straightforward, but working with all the different stakeholders to put in place the processes and the protocols and the kind of people infrastructure that will make this easier to do the next time around is what excites me. If we can succeed in this at a time when memories are fresh and there's funding available and people realize the importance of it, then we will have put in place something that will make us all sleep better at night. That's the way I look at it.
Wow. Well, but I think that the idea that you described what you do, that already makes me feel sleep a little bit better. I had no idea that this was even, kind of a core aspect of what we were doing, and the fact that you were able to respond in such real time to be able to make your team move that much faster. I think that's fantastic. It is the case that your data is your predictions are only good as the data. And so the idea of being able to create a higher fidelity data stream and be able to make that, I mean, that seems like it seems like a daunting task because of the people issues, I would say, probably, as you say, more than the technology. But it's exciting to think that people are actually going to try to make that work. So I'm excited that I want to remind everybody, any questions that they want to put in, please put into the Q&A, and we're going to try to answer them as they come up. One of the areas that we're seeing, and I think that you and I got a chance to talk about this in our pre-meeting, was really around staffing. So there was this remarkable response, and what we might think of as either burnout or a variety of inputs that have changed our ability to be able to staff. And without people, kind of your data and your predictions, unfortunately, they cannot fix people not being there to be able to do these things. So how, one is, what do you see on the horizon, and what did you guys see as the staffing issues arose? And then what do you see in terms of, are we bouncing back? Are we coming back to a better place on that side?
Thank you so much for asking that, because I didn't want to leave this forum without setting the stage as to where we are and where we're going, especially with respect to staffing. So let me just set the stage here. So right now, where we are is that COVID numbers are going down. Last we looked at it, 3% of cases in hospitals are currently COVID, which is great news. But occupancy and demand is through the roof. We have historically high occupancy rates at hospitals. And obviously some of that is the delayed care. We delayed electives for almost 2 years. So people are rushing to the hospital to get the care that they delayed. And because they delayed it, they're sicker. So acuity is higher. The other piece, I think, that is really worrisome, and it is going to be like number 1 or 2 or 3 on our agenda going forward, is the behavioral health system. Behavioral health system is under tremendous strain. It's always been a system that needed a lot of help, but now it's unprecedented. We have routinely hundreds of people waiting either in the ED or in the medical surgical units of our hospitals, simply because they can't be placed in a behavioral health bed. I think that at its height in the past few weeks, we track this every week, it was 700 patients in our 60 some hospitals waiting for behavioral health placement, and occupying a bed that should be occupied by someone who has medical or surgical conditions, but instead the bed is occupied by a behavioral health patient who is getting not ideal care, right? Suboptimal care, because that's not where they're supposed to be. So it's bad for everybody. So that is definitely going to be something that the healthcare system is going to have to resolve very quickly. And that's not the only issue. I mean, of course, we have throughput issues even in the other post-acute sector. So we're working on all these, but the one thing that rises clearly to the top is the workforce issue. So the workforce issue has, ever since I would say about December of 2020, and then certainly since then, it has just risen to the top as one of our major concerns. So we are victims of the same great resignation that everybody is a victim of, but multiplied by 10. We have caregiver stress, physical stress, fatigue, moral distress, burnout. People have been resigning at very, very high rates. There's huge turnover. The turnover of one nurse can cost a hospital $40,000+ just to replace, and there are no replacements to be had. We have lost so many nurses they've left to become travel nurses, and the kind of hourly rates that are being commanded by travel nurses, and I love nurses, I have the highest respect for them, but realistically, this is an unsustainable amount. To be paying nurses $250 an hour is unsustainable for the healthcare system. So as potential patients, because all of us are potential patients, we have to be worried about a healthcare system that's facing this kind of workforce pressure. So it's going to be our task number 1 to figure out how to deal with the workforce issue, how to retain our workers, and how to keep them, worry about their well-being, but also figure out different ways of delivering care. Again, it's both daunting and exciting. You can look at it either way. It's like the person who looks out the window and either sees the sky or the puddle on the ground. It's up to you, but I feel some days I look at the puddle and some days I look at the sky, and I try to, balance it out. But there is no doubt that we are going to see a system that has to change. The financial fallout is yet to play out. The delivery system change that's going to be required to manage in the face of this workforce pressure is, I'm not even sure how our healthcare system is going to handle this, but it has to, because these kinds of rates are not sustainable. This kind of work, and we already have the highest cost healthcare system in the world. How much higher can we go? So we have to find a balance.
So
Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I mean, at many levels, right? So I do think that the question of how we bring more people in, and again, the Great Resignation, is a remarkable phenomenon. We're going to be learning a good deal, and as we talked about in our last two COVID conversations, there's just case study after case study, whether it's the biology of COVID or medical treatment, or how these teams came together, or the stories of how we've collected data and actually acted them. But in your experience now, having done this, and kind of what we hope is having made it through kind of the majority of this tsunami, how have we fared compared to other states? And and internationally, are there other stories that where we can think about what they were doing? I would imagine readiness is not even, there's nobody that was prepared for this. But are there kind of places that have fared well in the United States in terms of being able to have responded in the way that Massachusetts had?
That's kind of a difficult question to answer, because it depends on the metric that you're looking at. So you're absolutely right. Nobody was really ready. And certainly in some states, everybody was pulling in the same direction, whereas in some states, the state government was singing a different tune than the public health officials. So I'm glad I don't live in one of those states, so it's hard for me to compare myself with them. But what I will tell you is that I was very excited to find out that some of the things we're grappling with in this state, other states figured out ways to do them better. So usually we have this arrogance in Massachusetts that we're doing it best. And if we're not doing it, no one else is. And what we were surprised to find out is that many states use very innovative approaches for situational awareness, the same situational awareness that I was talking about that we need to have. We need to have a big picture of where the beds are and where availability is. And a lot of states have done very innovative things. They've partnered with technology companies, and they've set up dashboards, and they've used them very creatively. Some of them having a centralized, government role where the data comes into the state government and the government decides where to send patients. Some of them using a hospital as their quasi, central, locus where that decision is made and everybody accepts the decision, and others using groups of hospitals. And as we talk to states that we don't traditionally look to for learnings, we are humbled by how they handled this issue. And that's been a new aspect of my job that over the past few months, I would say, where I've had to talk to, Arizona and Oregon, and I'm like, wow, you guys did this? That is so smart. Why didn't we think of it? So I think in some respects, it's very hard to answer your question, Jack, because I can't really say, oh, this state did it better or that state did it better, because it depends on the metric you're looking at. But from a data perspective, there are certainly states that did it better than us. And a lot of them are on the West Coast, and we're learning from them. That's the beauty of this, that no one is holding back. There's no sense of, pride of ownership here. I'm amazed at how open they are about sharing what they did and how it worked and what didn't work. And so we're learning every day.
Yeah. Well, I think you passed on a lot of praise to the hospitals for, kind of pulling down their barriers so that they could communicate. And it is nice to see that, you should take a bit of a pat yourself on the back that you did the same at a state level, right? That the states can now also do that same level. We're the Mass General Hospital, and then there's the Portland Hospital, and they may never talk to each other, but here's a unique opportunity for these two people to be humbled by kind of the opportunities that these kind of interactions afford. So again, this could not have happened if people didn't put other people first, right? And patients first. And making sure that that happened is something that's kind of key. There is a question in the Q&A around, have you ever thought of writing a book? And it's funny that this came out because you and I talked about a book beforehand. So I don't know if you want to just relate that story, and then kind of, have you thought about that?
So I'll answer your question first,
Yeah.
and then the question about me writing a book. I was, after initial shock of the pandemic, I was looking for a good book, and one of the books I came across, and I wanted to make sure it was not the kind of book that spent most of its time bashing the previous administration, because I had already had enough of that. So this book by Michael Lewis called Premonition. If anyone on the call hasn't read it, I would highly recommend it. And Michael Lewis is a terrific writer anyway. But this book exposes the behind the scenes heroes, the unsung heroes, those who developed the initial pandemic plan during the Bush administration, which then was inherited by the Obama administration, and then worked behind the scenes in the last administration to make sure that states did what was required in terms of social distancing, masking, and other public health measures, and how difficult it was to get their message through. It's a fascinating book. I literally couldn't put it down. I picked it up on Friday and I couldn't put it down until I finished it. So highly recommend it. One of the best books on the pandemic I have read so far. As far as me writing a book, I don't think that I have a life that interesting that people would want to read about it. But I would love to write a book about the untold stories of the pandemic. That is something I would love to do, because I have had the privilege over the past 2 years. I always loved working for Massachusetts hospitals, but in the past 2 years, I have had a sense of, just the sheer privilege of working with these amazing people, whether they're, there's the stories from the nurses, the nurse leaders are just heartbreaking. They're trying to manage in such difficult circumstances, taking care of these patients. But at the same time, they have to deal with the very real, moral trauma that their staff are going through. The frontline nurses who have seen patients die without ever having met their families. This is very real. And thankfully, we never got to the point where we had to choose between patients, because we got through the worst of it without having to do some of what Italy had to do. But these are the real heroes of the pandemic, the frontline workers, the first responders, the people within the walls of hospitals. And I think their stories need to be told. So if I ever write a book, that's what it's going to be about.
Well, do not leave yourself out. I think that, it is certainly the case that data is always underappreciated. We never really understand what it can tell us. I think that if I'll tell you what you should write the book about. I am, again, I'm always humbled by, and I have the privilege of getting to talk to all of you guys that are really at the front lines and have been able to, help us weather this storm. We'll just never know, right? There's not the control experiment of what it was like to do this, in another way. So luckily, we, as hard as it was, it would have been much worse. So we're lucky for that. But I did want to just end on a note, which is what I really am always just dismayed by is just your path. It's an amazing path. You start with, growing up and I can only imagine. I have 2 daughters, so I really feel for your father to kind of open up the debate and and let everybody read all the books and debate, and then have them choose these remarkable occupations. And he must be so proud, particularly now that you're interested in numbers, being a math professor himself. Yes. But then have you transition to an MPH and fall in love with numbers. It's that nonlinear path. It's that curiosity. At every stage, you've talked about how things were exhilarating, like that. There's if there's a kind of X Games of data, maybe you found it, right? Kind of the adrenaline rush from trying to work with data, and so that's exciting. So I wouldn't put authorship off the table. you've pretty much covered a lot of ground already. And so I don't think that, that's out of the realm here. But I really, the way that you followed your passion and that you recognize passion in other people, I think that, that's something that I want people to be able to really make sure that they take away from our evening tonight. In addition to the stories that you told, there's just no doubt that, this is the book's not written in terms of it's not over yet, but we're going to really learn a lot about how we did such a great job, and people like yourself are at the center of that. So thank you very much for, your service. This is, this was a military type operation, the way that it was organized in terms of everything we had to do. I don't know if you have any last words. I know that we're going to close out the night now, but thank you again, Anu, for your things. And I'm going to give you the last word.
My last word is I'm not the hero. The heroes are in the walls of hospitals. But thank you for having me.
No, well, thank you. All right. Take care, everybody. We'll see you next time. Take care. Bye.